Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Tax incentives, school safety, and what's allowed on a license plate. Tonight, on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian, and thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by a roundtable of journalists talking about some of the biggest stories of the week, starting with Toby Sells from the Memphis Flyer. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you, sir.
Deja Henry from the Daily Memphian. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you.
Along with Bill Dries, reporter with the Daily Memphian. We'll start, Bill, with you and tax incentives, not surprisingly, often in the news and being reviewed at a couple different levels and some proposals. And maybe we start with city councils looking at some changes to the pilot. EDGE President Reed Dahlberger is leaving after 11 years. And the DMC, Downtown Memphis Commission, its related entities are initiating a review. Not all of this is against the backdrop of the massive Ford plant and associated manufacturing. All that stuff outside Shelby County, but may well generate even more economic development within Shelby County. So walk us through what's on the table.
This is an issue that never really goes away. Sometimes it's not as apparent, but it's always there. So it doesn't take much to bring it up. Basically, Martavius Jones on the city council has been kicking around this idea that the minimum wage that a company or economic development project has to pay in order to qualify for one of the EDGE incentives is too low. It's now at $13 an hour plus health benefits paid by the employer. And he says that given what that $13 an hour gets you, that amounts to incentivizing poverty. So his proposal is to raise it to $21 an hour. He had what amounted to a test vote in council committee, and he was the only one of the 8 council members present who voted for it. So there's still some discussion there, and the discussion is really heightened because of Reed Dahlberger announcing his exit from EDGE, and in June, the city and county will start reviewing the incentives that EDGE offers as part of the regular schedule of reviewing what that organization does. So some council members said they saw Jones's point on a higher minimum wage, maybe not necessarily for $21 an hour, but that they wanted to wait until June. So we'll see if he tries to bring it to a vote. Meanwhile, the Downtown Memphis Commission on its own has started a review of the similar incentives, tax breaks offered by the Center City Revenue Finance Corporation, which comes under their umbrella.
The EDGE board president, outgoing Reed Dahlberger, the new one will be appointed by County Mayor Lee Harris and City Mayor Jim Strickland. Toby, Mayor Harris has been a critic of the incentive sort of complex or situation. Sure. Talk about that.
For a long time he has been, but over the summer he did a panel discussion on tax incentives with the Beacon Center of Tennessee, which is a free market think tank based in Nashville. On there, Harris really railed against incentives just in general, saying they kind of pick economic winners and losers. He didn't feel like these tax incentives were deal makers or deal breakers really for any of these, but consultants can go to these companies and say, if you're thinking of building in Shelby County, how can you leave this money on the table, of which they feel obligated to take the money. He also said that as incentives now, the kind of the horse is out of the barn, right? Like it's kind of hard to rein them back in. And on the flip side of some of that, though, talking of Dahlberger, I've heard him say before that, all these other entities out there, all these governments are offering tax incentives. If we don't, we're kind of losing the arms race, as it were. And to him, he said that, giving these tax incentives is kind of like, spending a little bit of money on a lottery ticket and then winning the lottery, right? Yeah. So that's kind of the two sides of the coin.
I think we had, it was a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now, when we had former Downtown Memphis head Jennifer Oswald and Reed Dahlberger on. And one of the things they told us, Bill, was, in the end, they feel like they use these pilots to compete against other cities to lower what is comparatively a much higher tax rate, because there's city county taxes in Memphis. That the answer, that they're not necessarily huge fans of them as a tool, that they're a blunt tool, I think is what they talked about, that if the county wanted to make themselves more competitive with other cities, they'd lower taxes. They have since then lowered taxes somewhat with reappraisal, but I still think that most of the commercial real estate and economic development people you talk to, their perspective is we're still not competitive without tax incentives.
Yeah, and some of the pushback in Jones' proposal for raising the minimum wage to get these incentives came from the Greater Memphis Chamber, who said, look, the timing on this is really bad because we just had the Ford plan announcement in Haywood County, which is not in Memphis, is over one county over from Memphis in effect. But they said we're looking at some supply chain companies that might supply this plant, and this sends the wrong message to them. It's a chicken and egg argument, because at some point you have to look at the incentives and say, okay, if we're doing better, if these are working, theoretically at least, at some point, you would look at the incentives and say, we don't need them.
Yeah.
And to the point that Toby made, I've talked to people who have gone before these boards for the incentives who have said, we really don't like going in public with the details of our project and what we're going to do because we have competitors, but we feel like everyone else is going to apply for them, so we should. Right. So it's not strictly a matter of this project needs it and it won't succeed and we won't get the benefits. It's a matter of it's money on the table, and these companies feel like they have to at least apply for it.
Well, I think they'll also, and again, I'm just what I hear from people in the business, the construction costs are skyrocketing, materials costs are skyrocketing, labor costs are skyrocketing, and land prices are skyrocketing. And so they're looking for, at this point, maybe there was a time when it was really cheap and easy to build in Memphis compared to other places. That time isn't really, it's not quite as cheap and easy as it used to be. I think also some of the people looking at $13 minimum wage requirements would say, and I mean this sort of flippantly, or they would say it flippantly, I'd love to be able to pay somebody $12. Right now in this labor market, people are paying $15, $16, $20 an hour. I mean, Memphis Police Department has $15,000 signing bonuses. We had Sheriff Bonner on. They're doing $5,000 plus signing bonuses to get deputies. So the market kind of sometimes is not totally in sync with what's going on with these incentives. Last thing I'll say is that we'll have people from the Memphis Chamber on in a couple of weeks to talk about the Ford plant and the potential halo effect on the whole region, Memphis included, as well as other economic development folks from the suburbs in the coming month or two to talk more about this massive, massive project. I want to switch now to schools, though. And Deja, there was a tragic, really awful shooting couple of weeks ago. A couple of 13-year-olds in an argument, which is just, astoundingly sad. It's all sad, but it was astoundingly sad. Thankfully, the boy who was shot is recovering or is recovered. But it triggered, brought up again a conversation about school safety and how school security happens. What's under discussion?
Yes, Eric. So this conversation was kind of ongoing, especially with in the past couple school board meetings, there have been, or in the past one that there was public comment available, there was a majority of the time was spent talking about police officers and getting them out of schools by different activist groups and students who had seen or had negative experiences with police officers. So it's an ongoing conversation, and the issue at hand before this shooting took place was getting the people wanted to get the sheriff's deputies out of the schools.
Yes, and it's technically the Shelby County Sheriff's deputies, not MPD, right? It
So
used to be. Are there some MPD in
There are MPD. Okay. So the school district has a contract with both MPD and the sheriff's office. Okay. And they provide officers who are trained, but there are officers who are trained and employed by Shelby County Schools as well. Yeah,
and the notion of what Dr. Joris Ray, the superintendent of Shelby County Schools, has talked about a quote-unquote peace force. So hiring their own staff, works directly for Shelby County Schools, and is trained in a different approach?
Mm-hmm. So this approach would basically be about building relationships with students and moving away from the focus on arrests and interactions with the court systems within schools. So Superintendent Ray once this shooting happened, there was a school resource officer on the premises and they were the one who called the police. So he kind of doubled down on the fact that, he said there is a place for officers in these schools. And so now this idea that they are introducing or reintroducing, because it has been introduced before, is about having their own, what they're calling Peace Force. So they won't call it a internal police department, but
and there's an emphasis on psychology or discussion about more psychologists, more social workers, more de-escalation training. I think one of the activists you quoted in a story said that called, and this is their opinion, that Shelby County Sheriff's Department, by being in the schools, is solidifying a school to prison pipeline. So, I mean, I'm not saying that's true, but there's a lot of frustration, at least among some parents. I think there's also a lot of fear among some parents, and the shooting obviously, reinforced that. You also talked about, was it Denver that made a big shift, similar shift?
So Denver ended their contract with their local police department and opted for something like what Shelby County Schools is suggesting.
Yeah.
And it's a conversation that's going on all over the country. Just earlier this year in Knoxville, when there was a student who was shot and killed by a police school resource officer, there was conversation about removing the officers from the schools.
But, and Fraser Community Schools, which is a charter school, with Bobby White, Dr. Bobby White, who's been on the show a number of times talking about schools and charter schools, which are separate, independent, still public schools, but have more independence from the Shelby County School District. They've removed all their...
They've removed officers and moved away from exclusionary discipline, so things like expulsions that would remove students from a learning environment.
Right, okay. More to come on that, and we'll come back to some education issues. I wanted to touch, though, Toby, go to you. Mississippi has a water lawsuit against Tennessee. This gets to the aquifer, and we in Memphis talk a lot about the Memphis aquifer. The aquifer is actually doesn't know the borders of Memphis or Tennessee or Mississippi. It goes across a massive swath of underground, touches, I think, all the states in the region and many cities. Talk about what's going on with this lawsuit.
Mississippi brought their 16-year-old lawsuit against the state of Tennessee to the U.S. Supreme Court last week. And they had a kind of a different argument this time. They said that Tennessee is kind of violating Mississippi's sovereign borders as they're trying to pump water from Tennessee. It's coming over from the Mississippi side. They argued the state shouldn't do that. They want payments of $600 million from the state going forward if they're going to continue to pump the water. As you said, this is the Middle Claiborne Aquifer. It's huge. We talk about the Memphis Sand all the time, but this one is an enormous aquifer that runs under many, many states. And so that's what a lot of the justices were talking about. Chief Justice John Roberts likened it kind of to wild horses in different places that don't understand, or they go across borders all the time and they don't have they just kind of flow freely. That the water here in the aquifer did the same thing, right? And it doesn't know state lines. Stephen Breyer, Justice Breyer, said he likened it to the fog in San Francisco. He said, what if somebody can go and get the fog over San Francisco and teleport it over somehow to Massachusetts? Is it kind of the same thing? And Justice Sonia Sotomayor, she wondered to Mississippi, when is enough enough, is what she said. You've been doing this for 16 years. If we tell you no again this time, will you bring it back? The lawyer from Mississippi said, we will bring it back.
And their argument, Bill, you've covered this as well. The argument is Mississippi wants to be able to pull more water, or I've sort of lost track of what and this isn't your fault, Toby. It's just mine.
It sounds like it's shifted to become a revenue thing for Mississippi. And the interesting thing is that the comments from the justices seem to suggest that they're not open to this idea that you got Mississippi's water in effect.
Right.
But gotcha. But that doesn't mean that there won't be changes as a result of this, or couldn't be changes as a result of this, because in their questioning and comments, the justices also seemed much more friendly to the idea of apportionment. And that is that there is a recognition that the aquifer is under 8 or 9 different states, and that there should be some kind of pact among those states for how water is withdrawn, which could leave Mississippi with some share of that water, just not as much as it wants, and certainly not payments from Tennessee for accessing that water.
Right. And all this against, again, I've used the word backdrop too much today, but I'm going to do it again. It's against a backdrop. You look out west, you look in the Midwest. There are massive water shortages. The Colorado River is at the lowest level at least in historic or in recorded history. Right. We have this incredible water. I mean, I remember a time 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago where the Memphis Chamber began to really promote our water, our clean water, our plentiful water as a reason for businesses to relocate here. They kind of sort of slowed down on that and thought, well, maybe we don't want everybody coming in and drilling and doing what they want with the water. But that's the other part of this. And of course, protect our aquifer and the recent oil pipeline fight. Right. We have this incredibly valuable resource that I think we used to just take for granted, but now we realize it's precious and it's in many ways unique.
And Memphis and Shelby County is so lucky to have this vital resource, as you said, looking out west where all of these different government entities are fighting each other and how do we get water to these different places. And that was one of the arguments was for the attorney for Memphis Light, Gas and Water. He said that the Middle Claiborne Aquifer, we've pumped out of it for 100 years. He said it's full. Mississippi wants to pump more water out of there. The water is going to be available to them, and and there's no need for further litigation on it.
I want to come back to schools and talk about two. We'll start with sick leave and COVID. COVID is not over, although I want so desperately for it to be so. But the schools obviously have been managing testing, managing masking, managing vaccines are not required. They're not even allowed for the younger kids, although they may be soon. They also have a whole staff, right, of teachers and employees. The school system announced retroactive sick leave. What was that about? For some reason, that caught my eye.
So before this school year, or during this school year rather, Shelby County Schools employees, teachers, staff all had to use their regular sick leave that they're granted, building up over time, and many were kind of upset about that because with COVID, you have to quarantine.
You may not be sick, you may not be, but you're out. Okay.
Right, exactly. So you may be out from school, and that's taking up all your sick days. So this retroactive sick leave goes back to this summer, and people who have used their sick leave will be granted that credit for that time. But it is only for if you actually did have COVID, not if you had to quarantine.
Not if you had to quarantine. And it's an extra 10 days
that
people would get. I'll stay with schools, and we'll Bill, this is that point in the show or the year when I ask you to explain what is BEP, because I can never remember what it stands for. But it is basically that, in this case, Governor Lee and Education Commissioner Penny Schwinn are talking about possible big changes to the funding formula known as BEP of how districts around the state get their state money for education.
Basic Education Program. That's what BEP stands for. You were close, weren't you?
I was. It was this close.
Okay. It's a formula that really took on its current structure during the McWhorter administration starting in the late 1980s. And Governor Lee has said we want to go into that. This is the state formula that determines how much state funding a given school district gets, and it's very complex. So Governor Lee wants to go back into that and take a look at it, review it, see how it works, make it more efficient. There have been 2 lawsuits over this in the last almost 40 years. One for small rural school systems in the district who felt like they were not being treated fairly, and then a lawsuit by large urban school systems, including what was then Memphis City Schools, who said, well, as a result of those changes, we feel like we're not being treated fairly in the share of state funding that we get. So this has been litigated. There's been a lot of debate about it. Lee, as I understand it, wants to put this on the table and examine it completely without regard to a court argument for a certain party and making a settlement with them.
He said that he wants to be more student-centered versus district-centered. Some Democrats, according to Ian Round, who covers the legislature for us, think that means that there's going to be a shift to even more school vouchers. And Ian had some interesting stats on over the last, 20 years, spending on education in Tennessee has increased by about 3% a year. We're still very low on 44th, I believe, 45th in the country in spending. So we'll see where all that goes. Lee did clarify, though, that none of this shift in funding or changes in funding involves an increase of taxes. Anything else on funding on that?
I would just add that there are 18 committees that the state just announced that would be working on this issue, and people can apply to be on those committees. But
18 around the state, essentially?
Around the state. So there are things, but they're like topic based.
Okay.
So one of them is about urban school. There's like a rural school district committee,
Right,
urban
right.
school district.
Okay. Good to know. With 5-6 minutes left here, parks are in the news. There's a rebranding of the Parks Commission. There's a bunch of spending. The Greensward argument seemed to flare up, sort of, kind of. I, as always, have to disclose I was a former board member of the Overton Park Conservancy and was board chair when, in fact, the agreement was signed between the city, the zoo, and OPC for the plan that now seems to be going forward. And part of the I think there was some confusion, even I was confused, and I'm pretty close to this, although I haven't been on the board in a few years, that help me out here, Bill, there was a plan agreed to by the parties that would involve getting parking off the Greensward forever, but about an acre of the Greensward, a kind of low portion between the zoo parking lot and kind of out of sight, was going to be used for parking for an expanded zoo parking lot. The city a couple years ago said, wait, hold on, we might be able to build a parking deck. Let's review that. That was a couple years ago, and then they recently came out and said what?
They recently said the parking deck that we thought would cost $3 million, which was the money raised by the Overton Park Conservancy and the zoo at $1.5 million each. It's more than that. It's actually not $3 million, it's more than $5 million. So the city and the zoo announced we're going back to the original plan, which was to take part of the western edge of the Greensward, part of the northern edge of the Greensward, and increase the reconfigured zoo parking by a total of 415 net additional spaces
Right.
there.
Along with the reconfiguration of the Prentice Place parking lot, which I think has already mostly been done.
Yeah.
Toby, you've covered this over the eternity that this fight went on. I mean, it's like 30 or 40 years.
I can't believe we're still talking about the Greensward.
Tell me.
But on the activist side and all those folks that would go out and protest against what the zoo was up to, you can just imagine how they feel, right? I mean, and they've been railing against this plan online. Whatever material protests they may do in the future hasn't been known just yet, but to say, you know what, we're going to leave it intact, we're going to leave the Greensward as it is now 100%, we're going to do this other thing and it's a great solution for everybody, and then for it to go dormant for a couple of years, you don't hear about it, and then all of a sudden they say, you know what, actually, we are going to do that. We're going to pave this portion over here. And it just kind of throws them into, this kind of crazy loop, right? Like, what, I can't believe we're going back to this old plan again. So you kind of see some of the old apparatus, the protest apparatus of these folks getting dusted off and getting ready for a fight.
And also there's a lot of discussion about, okay, so it's over $5 million.
The parking deck would have been.
Couldn't we find the extra 2 to 3 million from some other place?
Well, and that segues into Accelerate Memphis, which is this big reset refinancing of city debt. It created about a $200 million windfall, much of it going to parks and green spaces and open spaces, other to neighborhoods and so on. Who wants to take, I mentioned the rebranding of the Parks Commission. It's more than a rebranding, though. It's an attempt to sort of refocus, and again, with this big pool of money coming towards parks and open spaces.
The emphasis is on programming for the parks, and longtime Memphians will remember when that was the case, when parks under the Parks Commission, which was done away with at the start of the 21st century, that the Parks Commission oversaw a massive set of, for instance, softball leagues, sometimes referred to as beer leagues, that played
softball and beer.
Softball and beer. Who would have thought? But that was a massive organizational structure that a lot of people were involved in, involving maybe 30 to 40 beer league games on a given Saturday. This is kind of a start of a return to that, and
minus some of the beer.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it's like kid soccer.
Well,
Yeah.
it shifted
Sorry.
over that time from softball to probably
Yeah.
soccer and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And the $200 million in Accelerate Memphis, $75 million of that is for new parks like Gaston Community
Yeah.
Center being redone, a new clubhouse at Pine Hill Golf Course,
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
And the great stuff happened with Green Spaces, the Overton Park Golf Course, $800,000 announced for Tom Lee Park, $1 million into Hinton Park in Collierville. But with just a minute or so left, Toby, you did a really good, really interesting story about a First Amendment fight about what can go on vanity personalized license plates. Let's talk about that with the caveat that this is public television and there's a lot we can't talk about interpreting some of the things that have been questionable. They
Right.
are all in your story at memphisflyer.com.
Which made it a great flyer story.
Yeah.
But a decade ago, a Nashville woman applied for and received a vanity license plate, and she drove it around on 2 cars and never had a complaint. And then all of a sudden, someone saw it on the road. They complained directly to the chief of staff of the Department of Revenue, and then 30 days later, she gets a letter in the mail that says, "You give us that license plate. It's been deemed offensive. You can't have it. If you don't turn it over, you face fines and jail time." She decided to fight the decision. She hired an attorney in Nashville. And it's a Memphis story because it's a Tennessee story about what you can and can't say on these personalized plates. So far, there's been 2 federal decisions in that. One says it's government property, you can't just say whatever you want. The other said it's a First Amendment issue, you can say whatever you want. There's been no Supreme Court ruling on this before. We're going to get some more clarity in December on what you might not be able to say.
All right, go to memphisflyer.com to kind of decipher some of these. We can't really do them here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us. Remember, if you missed anything of the show, you can get it at WKNO.org or on YouTube, or download the podcast of the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.